I'm Sean Coughlin, Vice President of Sales and Business Development in Eastern North America, and I run our federal practice as well for Cloudian. Today we'll be talking about the strain that agencies have around their IT budgets, which they're really facing due to explosive unstructured data growth and increasing storage costs associated with that growth. And they need to keep data indefinitely. So we're really going to be talking about how agencies need to respond to combat these issues around the total cost of ownership, specifically around unstructured data, which leads to things like Splunk. So I'd like to introduce John Schneider. John is the solutions engineer for the national security programs at Splunk. Welcome, John.
Hi, thank you. Appreciate you having me here. So as you mentioned, my name is John Schneider, and I handle solutions engineering and security specialization within the national security programs team here at Splunk. So that would be within the IC community. And today I represent Splunk. And what we do at Splunk, if you're not already familiar, is that we make machine data accessible, usable, and valuable to everyone. We are a market leader in both the security SIM SOAR spaces as well as observability. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, thanks, John. Next, I'd like to introduce Jen Zintek. Jen is a solutions architect at ClearShark. Welcome, Jen. I would also like to congratulate ClearShark on being named Splunk's 2021 Public Sector Professional Services Partner of the Year. That's fantastic.
Yes, thanks, John. As you said, I am Jennifer Zintek. I do work at ClearShark. I've been working in the federal government for about 25 years, starting in the Air Force and then actually working as a customer at many of these local agencies. In the most recent years, I've been working at ClearShark. ClearShark is a value-added reseller for the federal government. We focus specifically on the public sector across DoD, civilian, and the intel communities. I focus specifically with the intel communities in Virginia. And the great thing about ClearShark is that as a reseller, we're very engineer focused. We spend a lot of time working on pre-sales architecture with our customer. And even though we have a very broad category of a lot of O&M vendors that we support, like Splunk and Cloudian, we choose them because we want to work with the very best of the O&Ms, and we want to make sure that we get very deep within their products and can support the customers in a very localized way and make sure they're getting sort of best of breed solutions. So thank you very much, Sean.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jen. Thanks to both of you for joining us. It's great to have you. Really excited. We're talking to many government agencies, and the common thing, the thread that they keep saying over and over to us is, help me lower my costs, right? How do I improve my total cost of ownership? So John, Splunk SmartStore API was developed to help customers do just that. Can you tell me a little bit more about how SmartStore came to be within the portfolio of Splunk?
Sure, absolutely. So SmartStore is a very interesting and kind of groundbreaking technology in that if you're not already familiar, Splunk runs a managed service offering called Splunk Cloud. And as part of that, we essentially consume our own product, right? And one of the goals for us was to reduce storage costs, both for our cloud offerings and on-prem offerings. And so what SmartStore was designed to do was to interact with a cloud or on-prem based S3 offering, which would allow us to reduce what we would call the classic Splunk classic index clustering. And so what it's designed to do is it is going to place your warm and formerly cold buckets of storage into S3 compliant storage, such as that from Cloudian. And so what this allows us to do is it reduces storage costs greatly, because what we are doing now is we're leaning on Cloudian to utilize their storage technology instead of using the repeated storage of multiple objects within a classic Splunk storage architecture, where there's a lot of repeated buckets sitting around. And so what we can do is we can leverage the Cloudian storage to allow us to get that high availability and data resiliency from their platform instead of having to rely on replication of data within Splunk. Further, what it allows us to do is we can scale the storage and compute resources differently, right? So if we can leverage the immense scale of that backend storage, we can focus more on the compute side with those indexers, right? So if we have a situation where the CPUs and that sort of thing aren't being pegged all that much, but we need additional storage, that's a fantastic use case for SmartStore, right? Further is kind of the bootstrapping capability of SmartStore, whereas previously, if you added a new indexer into the cluster, you'd have to do a rebalancing operation so that it would kind of be able to join that cluster. Whereas now, with all that data living in Cloudian and S3 compliant storage, SmartStore says, hey, I want to attach a new indexer to this thing. And we're ready to go almost instantaneously because it has access to all that historical data. So it gives us a lot of advantages there, which also means that from a recovery perspective, that if you do have some sort of hardware issue or an entire site goes offline, the time to recovery is dramatically better when you're using SmartStore, in conjunction with that storage. So,
yeah, and traditional ways of recovery for Splunk environments, like this sounds like way more from the ability to return to operation. It sounds dramatically easier, right, and faster. Is that true?
That's, yeah, totally fair. And so it allows us to, like you said, recover much more quickly, lower overall storage requirements, and we can do essentially, simplified upgrades, expansion, almost like a container model, if you will, of spinning indexers up and down if necessary.
Yeah. So Jen, different government groups, they have lots of needs to check their boxes, but when you pair, Cloudian with Splunk, it just works, right? I mean, that's what we've been told over and over again. But can you talk about some of the engineering reasons why customers like the combination of Splunk and through the SmartStore API to Cloudian around the cost savings?
Sure.
Or really aside from the cost savings, right, from the technical aspect.
Yeah, I mean, it works in both cases, right? You're going to get the benefit of cost savings, but it also makes things in a way less complex. And a lot of the things that John just talked to about, being able to add indexers much more easily, even if you lose an indexer and you have to restore that back in the cluster, it's so much faster when you have that done with SmartStore than waiting for that cluster to rebuild just by doing it the traditional way. And so with Cloudian in the mix, one of the other things I think that customers like is that you have storage that's really well known on your indexers. You know what you need for the cache. So what SmartStore does leave on all the indexers is an amount of cache. So when you're doing searching, you're actually doing that initial searching for a certain amount of period, maybe 3 months of that is left as cache on your indexers. So knowing that you only have to say have a certain amount of storage for that cache to work, and then the rest of your data, when you're growing your data, you're growing it on the Cloudian cluster. And it's just a much easier way to grow that cluster because you can just keep adding to the cluster and it just expands the data available to all your indexers all at the same time, as opposed to trying to scale each one of those indexers. And I mean, some of our customers have, 40, 50, 60 indexers working for, many, many terabytes of data. And so having to figure out how to grow every single one of those indexers takes a lot of time, not just from the cost of increasing the storage on the indexers in the classic way, but also having people having to do many, many different touch points on many, many different systems, as opposed to looking at, your one Cloudian cluster that you need to grow and upgrade and continue to have that larger set of data. So I think that really works into the value overall.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of people don't really look at those OpEx costs, but they become so so large, and they really need to have it pointed out to them a lot of times. Like, hey, look how many man hours are being spent around this scale. So being able to consolidate that is definitely a huge benefit. So John, maybe you could tell me, like, hey, SmartStore is great, but where's the traction with SmartStore within the federal government?
Sure. Within my space, within the IC, we have a lot of classic Splunk deployments out there. But everything that I have seen within the last 2 to 3 years has been deployed using SmartStore, right? So there are places where classic Splunk indexing architecture still exist. And a lot of times that's maybe in like a test dev environment where we're talking about small data sets and they're just kind of playing with it for a hot moment. But in general, every deployment I have seen for a production instance of Splunk for the last 24 months has been utilizing SmartStore, and it's because of all those reasons, with the cost savings and the flexibility of the platform to utilize S3 compliant storage, and even some of the large classic architectures are moving to SmartStore as well, right? So it's a little, in my opinion, it's easier to start off using SmartStore than to migrate from Classic to SmartStore. But even the ones that are still on Classic architectures are moving themselves to SmartStore because of those benefits. And because of that, I would say that it wouldn't surprise me that if SmartStore became the default index architecture, going forward for almost any deployment.
Yeah. No, interesting. So, so John, you got all these data sources coming in, and maybe you could take us through, like, as those data sources come into that hot Splunk tier. Maybe walk us through what's that flow of data for the first 24 or 48 hours.
Sure, absolutely. So the way it works is, initially speaking, it works identically to classic Splunk index clustering, right? So what we do is we bring in that data and we store that to a local cache. So regardless if it's classic or SmartStore, it's being ingested to that indexer. And if you're familiar with Splunk index clustering terms, it's what we deem to be hot data. Hot data is essentially a bucket that we are actively writing data to. And in a classic architecture, as you can see there on the screen, as soon as we are done writing to that bucket, it gets tiered down to what we call warm data, which is recently written data, and it still sits typically on some of your high performance storage. So hot and warm, usually on SSD, NVMe disks, right? And then later on, once we've determined that data to be cold, it gets tiered down to cold storage, as you can see in the diagram there. What happens with SmartStore is that we essentially eliminate that cloud tier. That cold tier. And so we are indexing, traditionally speaking, on those indexers, but instead of tiering that down to, say, a locally spinning disk, we are now shooting that off through S3 to Cloudian storage. And what is happening there is that there is actually a cache manager that lives on these SmartStore enabled indexers. And so this is not just a one-way operation like it was in a classic architecture where it got moved from warm to cold. What actually happens is this cache manager, and if you're a technical person like me and you're familiar with how like CPUs work and how they have caches on them, what this cache manager does is it tends to prefer more recent data to be held in the local cache, because most often it's the most recent data that is accessed by a search. But if you have a search that is pulling historical data, what it will do is it will go and retrieve back from the S3 compliant storage. It'll retrieve that data back and hold that in its cache. And so that essentially it is trying to ensure the best, what I would call cache hits, where when you do the search, that the results are optimally stored on local storage. If not, it goes back out to S3 to Cloudian and retrieves those events. So it's a bidirectional operation there. But further, if you have an index cluster, what normally happens is that you have many, many copies of these cold buckets living out there, and that is where a lot of the data reduction happens when we move to a SmartStore architecture. Is that now we are storing just a single copy of that data within the Cloudian stack, and that way we don't have 3 or more copies of that data sitting out there. So it's a great cost savings.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, we Cloudian's able to do some really advanced storage techniques around erasure coding, which essentially increase utilization while lowering the cost of storing the data. So I mean that's really the underlying technology that's saving providing the cost savings at the end of the day. So Jen, with ClearShark being Splunk's #1 reseller in the federal market, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what the adoption is around S3 and again the SmartStore API as well.
Sure. Yeah, we've actually had really good success, like as John said, especially in the last year, but we've really definitely seen interest within the last, I think, 18 to 24 months as well. People being very interested in what SmartStore is and the ability to get sort of the data into a cheaper storage area that can have the larger data lakes. We actually have one of our customers that I work with personally. They were looking at rolling out sort of a multi-terabyte system this year, and they're adding even more terabytes in the following year as they're gradually moving a lot of stuff from another logging system into Splunk. And the very first thing we talked about was how you're going to build this architecture with S3 and put it into Cloudian. It was bar none the first recommendation that we have from them. Whatever else they did, we're putting all the data into SmartStore because it's going to be the most efficient way for them to grow their data. It's going to be the most known way for us to engineer the rest of the solution. We put the rest of the solution on a hyper-converged system for the fast ingest, but we definitely wanted to push that large data lake out onto the Cloudian system. And so they were very excited about that prospect. That's right now, it's in the process of being installed, being delivered, and starting to get put into place. And they're already looking at, hey, we're going to replicate this as well to another one of our data centers sometime later in this year. So it is something that they're very into doing. But we've also, it's funny, we talk about the large customers, and this is certainly a use case for the large customers, definitely, especially in the federal government where they're not keeping data online for 3 months or 6 months or a year. They want to keep that online reachable data for years. Not only are they keeping it online for years, they're keeping it, in data stores themselves for up into 20, 25 years. And so they need a place to store all that data, right? And they really need the data to be available. But I've actually had use cases for very small customers as well. People that have between 20 and 40 gigs of Splunk data coming in a day, but they're under that same constraint. They only have so much data on their indexers. They want a known place where they can grow that data, but they're also combining it at that same point. They're going to use Cloudian for SmartStore for Splunk. That's our first use case with them, but they're also going to use it to store backups. They're also going to use it to store some of their other data types. And so they can use it for more than just one thing. And that's the other great thing about it. It's not just that this is my Splunk data store. It can be my data store for a number of different things as well, especially because it's using an S3 API. It just makes it so easy for vendors to create those plugins to work together.
Yeah. So Jen, that brings up a good point. So what are like some of the application side use cases that most frequently come up with your customers?
Cyber, lots and lots of cyber use cases, of course. I mean, we have we have people who use the full range, right? They're definitely using it for IT operations as well, for classic, logging, auditing systems. But really, it's the threat hunting systems that are coming into place nowadays. The people that really want to look for anomalies, want to look at threats within their network. And when you're doing that, you're really looking at some of the data sets that are more like your NDR type tools, things that are pulling data off the full packet stream, maybe employing things like a data stream processor with Splunk, to where you're gleaning so much data off of that packet. And again, this is something where you need to keep a large amount of data to make the tools that are looking for anomalies, they need that large amount of data, right? So and when you're training, especially when you're training unsupervised data models, which is what things like user behavior analytics and other from Splunk, right, and other types of products that do that type of user behavior modeling, they really need large sets of data to train and really make the finite specifications to how you're going to find those anomalies. And again, being able to hold that large amount of data online, not have something that you're having to look onto an offline data store, is what's going to make all the difference to some of those tools. Yeah,
no, absolutely. If you don't have the data accessible in the time, to run the logic, you're going to miss the logic, right? Like, so.
Yeah.
Hey, John. So, dark data, right? So, unstructured data that's untapped. We hear a lot of users, talk about, how they've got, whether it be on, tape or on systems, but they've got, lots of data, and it's kind of ironic because, if you ask and, business IT managers, they're predominantly saying, hey, the more data, the better. I need to store the data. But then at the same time, there was a report, 65% of those IT managers and business managers state that their data is just sitting there in a dark state, right? Like, so maybe you can kind of talk a little bit of how you see Splunk utilizing machine learning to help transform these agencies' massive data silos, right? And how they can use those repositories with real-time analytics and monitoring capability.
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head there, and I would agree with Jen in terms of things like user behavior analytics, where they require those large data sets to train themselves and to operate more efficiently. I would also actually add that beyond just UBA in core like enterprise security or even core Splunk, we're able to run those data models and kind of dig up that intelligence that's present in that data. Further, I would also argue from a security aspect, I have customers out there who are still rolling data to tape. Believe it or not, tape is not dead. And the sad fact of the matter is that we've been seeing a lot of attacks, recently, where there are supply chain attacks, right? Where the actual, a vendor or somebody has been compromised in some way, and it's happened, quite a while ago. And if we're rolling that data to tape, within a span of just, let's say just 30 days, they're gonna have to get those tapes out of the closet to find out what happened, 6, 8, 9, 10 months ago, right? And so we need that data immediately accessible when we have those kinds of issues, so that we can, find out what happened, when it happened, and immediately triage those things. And if we're, like I said, if we're digging tapes out of the closet, that's not going to be possible. And so I would further argue that so having that data immediately accessible is extremely important. And to the AI/ML side is that if it's sitting out and it's dark, as you mentioned, if that data is dark and it doesn't have visibility on it, it can't add intelligence to the platform, right? So it's not going to be able to find those gems, if you will, or find those IOCs of, who was that person who clicked on the first ransomware email, right? Or maybe it's a low and slow attack, going across the infrastructure. And those types of attacks can be very hard to find because of their trail being relatively hard to detect. But if we have these vast data sets and utilize UBA and AI and ML, we can start to detect those things and start to point out the unknown threats within the infrastructure, because not everything is detectable just by a signature, right? So that's where I think having that data immediately accessible and usable is extraordinarily important, from a security perspective, as well as, IT operations.
Yeah, and you really, call out like a lot of the value proposition around Cloudian, right? So, Cloudian is a scale out platform for storing this unstructured data, as we mentioned before. So we could scale incrementally to hundreds of petabytes in a single namespace, right? Which is kind of key for delivering the data from the cold, warm state back into the data sets that need to be manipulated again. So having that fast access to the data, but then around cost, right? That's where we're having the data online, and we're typically if we measure against like cloud technologies that are out there today, our response time is measured in milliseconds, but our costs are about equal or even less than the cost of Glacier, right? Which is, measured in hours or even days, right? So that's the big value proposition around the Cloudian platform. So Jen, you've been designing and architecting sophisticated network monitoring and cyber solutions for a long time. So can you share, some of, how you've designed or the insight you have around designing those large data sets with time series data that can be used for identifying and detecting like cyber threats?
Sure. Yeah, as we said before, some of the more important data sources, right, are your packet streams. So I've been working with some NDR tools as far as pulling that data off the packet. But the great thing here, and what you need a lot in those time series, right, is events as they're happening, not just from your network, but from your endpoint. So, looking at getting good data from the endpoint, you want good data from the network, you want data from your security tools like IPS tools and firewalls and everything that you can kind of get your hands on, because every single one of those leaves a little bit of a different digital fingerprint, right? There's going to be something in a URL. There's going to be, something in an application on an endpoint. You might have, a piece of malware detected, or even bringing in IOCs, right? I mean, that's another thing we talk about a lot, is in conjunction with also having all your data, you also want to have those outside data sources, to put in with Splunk. But again, the more and more of the different types of data sources you can get with those very finite timestamps on them, the better you're going to get at detecting threats. And that's where we just keep going into. It's like, I want a bigger data set, I want a bigger data store. And a lot of people, they kind of hold off on what they can bring in just because, they don't have a place to store all that data. And so having a large data like that, you can, just like you said, expand so easily into hundreds of petabytes, means that we can now start bringing in all those different data sets that we need to be able to detect things like, ransomware attacks potentially either have happened or are happening, different malware attacks. John hit it on the nail there too. It's like a lot of things we really need to focus on are those unknown attacks, right? Things that you don't actually have a signature for. But being able to find that because of behavior, because of analytics, because you have enough data in the models to come up with some tippers on looking at the data in your data sets. So I think it's very important. Again, the more data you can have, the better you can be at training those models and detecting the threats. We've definitely seen that.
Yeah, no, definitely. So Jen, just touched on ransomware. John, maybe you can just talk to because we hear ransomware like almost every day, right? Whether it be in municipalities, in the government, in commercial, I don't want to name names, but it's literally hitting the news wires every single day. But maybe you could just talk a little bit, John, about hey, how could Splunk help prevent some of those attacks?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is I know it's in the news recently, ransomware, but it's only getting worse, frankly. Right? This started years ago, but we still seem to be dealing with it in a pandemic sort of way. But the way Splunk is able to address this, and this is where again relying on a large S3 compliant Cloudian storage helps us, is that we are able to ingest data from all of these endpoints, whether it's network, whether it's a host, whether it's a server, and we are able to detect these common Windows event codes, PowerShell scripts being kicked off, essentially the IOCs and TTPs that are indicative of a ransomware attack, right? Where we see many files being accessed and many files being processed. It's rare that a user is doing those sorts of things themselves, right? So we have the framework and we have the tools and we have the searches and the alerts that regardless of the flavor of ransomware out there, that is able to indicate when something unusual is happening like this. And Jen, I think, made a great point with things like unusual network connections, right? With the EDR logs and those tools to say, hey, why is this device communicating with this known dynamic DNS address, or maybe it's going to Eastern Europe or something like that, right? And so we need to ingest this information from all of the infrastructure to be able to detect the the initial point of compromise, right? So we can't just be saying, let's filter out we are only looking at these 3 Windows event logs. No, you need to look at all of it. It's because you're missing something if you're filtering it out.
Yeah. It's kind of ironic. You had mentioned pandemic and ransomware at the same time. So, a friend of mine down in the Southeast, he goes to a shopping center, which actually has a gas station to it, and a guy comes up to him and says, "Hey, I've got 3 of these, 16-roll Charmins. I'll trade you my Charmin for 3 gallons of gas," right? And it's like, I guess we know who the guy was that had all the Charmin, back last year, right? Like, so, hey, so with that, we're running out of time, but really appreciate both you, John, and Jen. Really wonderful to have your expertise and share with us. And again, just kind of wrapping up, the theme of this, Cloudian with Splunk, with ClearShark, being able to bring this all together will just lower cost, provide the ability to ascertain and gain value out of the data that you have, that unstructured data, and provide insights that are going to make for, frankly, better policies and better government, right? Like, and that's what it's all about, and that's what we're trying to do. So, with that, Jen, back to you.
Yeah, well, Sean, thank you very much for inviting me today. Again, we appreciate very much our partnership with both Splunk and Cloudian. You're definitely 2 of the vendors we work with quite a bit. So thank you for having me today. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And John, any last remaining thoughts?
No, again, I'll echo Jen. Appreciate working with Cloudian and ClearShark. We, work together all the time, so appreciate being able to kind of espouse the greatness, I would say, of SmartStore, because if you're not already using it, you should definitely be looking into migrating to SmartStore if you haven't already.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks again, everyone, for joining, and we'll see you again next time.